Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I'm a few minutes late. I thought I'd figured out how to go live using my computer at my desk, and I thought it'd be a little bit easier. Didn't work out so well. Anyways, we're here to finish out the first book in this big book of TumTum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall by Emily Bearn and pictures by Nick Bryce, published by Little Brown and Company. And if you remember, we left Aunt Ivy. She had just had her toe bitten, and she thought there were fleas in the sofa, and the mice with the General March Mouse were commencing their attack. Chapter 13. This is the last chapter in this particular section, part of this book, and then we'll start the new storyline. Nursing her toe on the sofa, Aunt Ivy did not hear the General's pistol going off, as the gun was smaller than her fingernail. But the mice heard it loud and clear, and as the explosion echoed around the room, they sprang from their hiding places, shouting, "Charge!" and ran madly toward her. She sat mesmerized, her eyes darting left and right as the full might of General March Mouse's army appeared before her, out of thin air. First she saw little orange lights on the bookshelf, then a dozen fluorescent mice flew from the shelves. She saw mice bursting from the windowsill and the waste paper bin and the log basket. She saw them spilling out of the chimney and springing from her suitcases and pouring out from beneath the armchair like a flood. This is just a dream, just a horrible dream, she thought, desperately trying to calm herself. Any second now, I'm going to wake up. Come on, Ivy, wake up, wake up. But she didn't wake up, and the mice kept coming. Then she felt something ticklish on her legs. She looked down to see the Colonel's disheveled platoon clambering out of the stuffing and scurrying up her shins. Finally, Aunt Ivy screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed. She battered her arms and kicked her legs, but to no avail, for now there were mice running all over her. They scuttled up the sleeves of her dressing gown and down the collar of her silk pajamas. They burrowed underneath the towel on her head, tickling her scalp with their claws. They hung from her bracelets. They somersaulted like acrobats on her necklace. Staggering to her feet, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror above the fireplace. There were mice perched on her shoulders. There were mice nuzzling her ears. There was even a mouse climbing onto her forehead. And there, standing boldly on the mantelpiece, was a mouse carrying a gun. This must be a dream, Aunt Ivy thought again. It must, it must. Suddenly there was the sound of footsteps. Right under Aunt Ivy's nose, General March Mouse pointed his pistol in the air and fired it 3 times. Singling the retreat, his bullets hit the ceiling, but they were too tiny even to graze the paint. The army scampered back to their hiding places so fast that by the time Mr. Mildew poked his head around the door a few seconds later, there was not a mouse in sight. But here's what she looked like with them climbing all over her. "Ivy, what on earth's going on?" he demanded. "Anyone would think you were being murdered." "I am, Walter, I am," she shrieked, looking down at her body in horror. "I am being murdered by mice." "Mice? What mice? Really, Ivy, are you feeling quite all right?" "They were here, Walter," she cried. They were. There were dozens, hundreds, thousands of them. A whole army of fluorescent mice. And they were armed, Walter. They were carrying guns." "Ivy," Mr. Mildew said gently, standing in front of the bookcase, inches from the brigadier's nose, "it is late, and you are overtired. Try and get some sleep, and then if you're still feeling out of sorts in the morning, we'll go to the doctor and get something to calm your nerves." But Aunt Ivy was not listening to him. "It's your wretched children," she stammered, "leaving crumbs in the dollhouse, encouraging them, giving them ideas, breeding an infestation." "Now go to bed, Ivy," Mr. Mildew said firmly. Then he shut the door and went back upstairs. He supposed his poor sister-in-law was having some sort of a turn, but he had spent another frustrating day trying to make his hungry mouse work, so he was feeling less sympathetic than he might have otherwise been. The General waited tensely behind the flower pot, and when he heard Mr. Mildew's study door bang shut, he stepped forward and let off his pistol again to signal the second charge. All at once, the mice leaped back out of their hiding places and raced toward Aunt Ivy. They knew now that she was more frightened of them than they were of her, which made them even bolder. The brigadier climbed right up onto her long nose, and the Colonel sat on her pointy chin. When she shrieked, he could see right inside her mouth. Goodness, he thought, looking at her huge tonsils and the deep black chute beyond. If I were to fall down there, I might never get out again. I might have to live the rest of my life inside Aunt Ivy's stomach. He shuddered and jumped down onto her shoulder. Blind with terror, Aunt Ivy ran to the kitchen and fled through the garden door. Walter, Walter, do something, she shouted as she stumbled across the lawn, her feet sinking into the snow. Then she tripped and collapsed under a pear tree, with 215 fluorescent mice scuttling all over her. Fearing Mr. Mildew might reappear, General Marchmouse stood on Aunt Ivy's forehead and fired his pistol 3 times again, sounding another retreat. As the mice were hurtling back into the kitchen, a light flashed on in the attic. Arthur and Lucy appeared at the window and peered down at their aunt in amazement. Then Mr. Mildew's head poked out of the window on the upstairs landing. Ivy, what exactly is going on now? There's Arthur and Lucy looking out the window. Mice, Walter, she wailed miserably. It's those confounded orange mice again. There are no mice, Mr. Mildew said, speaking very slowly and firmly, but not altogether unkindly. Now come back inside, please, Ivy, for all our sakes. The chill night air bit into Aunt Ivy's skin and slowly brought her back to her senses. It was a still, cloudless night. Nothing was stirring. She looked down at her dressing gown, at her arms, at her hands. There were no mice there, only a few little hairs, which her eyes were not sharp enough to see. Perhaps I did imagine it all, she thought weakly. Perhaps Walter's right. Perhaps I am going mad. Now come inside, Mr. Mildew called down again. Finally, Aunt Ivy got up and limped back toward the cottage. She hesitated a moment at the garden door, her hand trembling on the knob. Pull yourself together, Ivy, she told herself firmly. There is no such thing as a fluorescent mouse. Walter was right. You are overwrought. Taking a deep breath, she walked into the kitchen, and from all around the room she was watched by hundreds of twinkling eyes. General Marchmouse had repositioned his army. As Aunt Ivy pulled the door shut behind her, she heard a rustling sound coming from the laundry basket. She swung around and saw something orange glinting through the wicker. General Marchmouse, who was standing on the oven, fired his pistol, and the mice made their third assault, each platoon springing from a different hideaway. They came at her from the sink, from the vegetable rack, from the waste paper basket, from the teapot on the dresser. One platoon sprang out of a boot. But this charge was much briefer than the others, for Aunt Ivy seemed so frightened that the general thought it was unsporting to carry on for very long, and he withdrew his forces after less than a minute. The army evaporated, but Aunt Ivy remained huddled on the doormat a while, too fearful to move. Then she walked across the room on tiptoes and gingerly picked up the telephone. The mice watched from their hiding places as she rustled through the telephone directory, then hurriedly dialed a number. Is that Mr. Gleggle's round-the-clock cabs? Good. I need a car at once. 20 minutes? No, I need one now. I'll be dead in 20 minutes. Where to? Home, of course, to Scotland. And send me the fastest driver you've got. Then there was a sharp click as she replaced the receiver. Oh, I was wrong. There is at least one more chapter. Chapter 14. Aunt Ivy thought better of waking Mr. Mildew again. Instead, she hastily scribbled him a note on the back of an unpaid gas bill and left it on the kitchen table. Then the mice crept after her into the living room and watched from behind the door as she hurled her clothes into her suitcases and dragged them into the hall. When she heard the taxi spluttering to a halt outside, she tossed her black overcoat on over her robe and went out of the door wearing slippers. The mice all scrabbled up the curtains onto the windowsill and pressed their noses to the glass, watching avidly. The taxi had its headlights on full beam, and a tall, thick-set driver in a tweed cap got out. Aunt Ivy walked up the path toward him and pointed back toward the cottage, gesturing at him to collect the luggage. They heard him come inside, then saw him return to his car carrying 3 suitcases. Then he came back for the other 2, flung them all into the trunk, and opened the passenger door for Aunt Ivy to get in. The driver got inside and started the engine. Then there was a belch of exhaust fumes, and Aunt Ivy was gone. The mice watched as the headlights faded into the night, and they knew the battle was won. She's gone, they cried, waving their orange armbands into the air and jumping up and down with glee. The colonel was so elated that he made to kiss the general, but then he stopped himself, and they both looked a little embarrassed. The army trooped back to Nutmouse Hall, singing triumphantly, but the general lingered behind a moment in the living room, surveying the battlefield. Besides some dust that had fallen from the chimney, there was nothing to show that the charge of the Bright Brigade had ever taken place. No fallen bodies, no bloodied barricades. The general wished all his battles could have been like this one. He would not let it be forgotten in a hurry. I must telephone the Mouse Times first thing in the morning and make sure it carries a full report, he thought loftily, beginning to compose what he would say. He decided he would leave out the detail about him falling asleep on the mantelpiece. Back in Nutmouse Hall, Nutmeg and Mrs. Marchmouse had spent an anxious night sitting by TumTum's bedside, wondering what was happening in Rose Cottage. They had heard the general's pistol going off, and they had heard Aunt Ivy's terrible shrieking, and they had prayed all the while that the army was winning. It had certainly sounded that way. It was long after midnight when they heard the first of the troops returning through the front gates. Then the living room door burst open, and the general strode in. "The night is ours, ladies," he cried delightedly. "Aunt Ivy has been soundly defeated. She's retreated to Scotland in a taxi." Mrs. Marchmouse flung herself on him, weeping with joy. "Oh, darling, you are so clever and so brave, and to think that I imagined I might never see you again." The general smiled broadly, but then he looked down on TumTum, lying palely on the chaise lounge, and his expression turned to one of concern. "How is the patient, Mrs. Nutmouse?" he asked gravely. "His temperature is a little down, General, and he stopped being sick," she said. "There's definitely some improvement. I do hope he wakes up soon. His spirits are bound to improve when he hears that Aunt Ivy has gone." Even as she said it, TumTum's head moved stiffly on the pillow. Very slowly and tentatively, he opened his eyes. Then he blinked rapidly, like a creature who has lived all winter underground and burst up through the earth's surface on the first day of spring. "Did I hear you say Aunt Ivy has gone, dear?" he murmured, turning to his wife. He looked anxiously at the clock. "Oh, dearie me, have I been asleep long? I feel quite ravenous. I hope I haven't missed lunch." Nutmeg gazed adoringly at him, hardly daring to believe her eyes. He was still very pallid, but the sweat had lifted from his brow, and his eyes were clear and bright, quite unlike yesterday. "Oh, TumTum!" she cried joyfully, kissing him on his nose, which was healthy and moist again. "Yes, Aunt Ivy has gone, and you have missed more than lunch. You've missed a week of lunches, and a week of dinners, and a week of breakfasts and teas, and you've got so little tummy left that I'll have to think of another name for you." TumTum looked quite astonished. He patted his stomach and wondered where it had gone. He could remember going up to the attic the other night and tucking into a plate of chocolate that had tasted rather strange, but since then everything was a blur. "What's all that commotion?" he asked, hearing the mice clattering in through the front door. "That's the soldiers," TumTum Nutmeg said. "You've slept through a battle." "Goodness!" TumTum said, feeling more bewildered by the minute. Then his stomach started rumbling violently, and Nutmeg joyfully raced off to find him something to eat. "The poor troops will be starving too," she thought busily. "What on earth can I feed them all?" But when she entered her kitchen, she found the problem had been solved for her. A pork sausage, a full 6 inches long, had been discovered abandoned in the Mildew's grill, and the colonel and the brigadier had carried it back to Nutmouse Hall on their shoulders. There was also a whole slice of bread, which had needed 4 mice to carry it, and a knob of butter the size of a golf ball. Nutmeg instructed the officers to lay out the feast in the banqueting hall. The room had last been used on her wedding day, and this morning her mood was so celebratory that she wanted to see its shutters thrown open again. "Left out of the ballroom, Colonel, then 3rd door on your right. It's the room with the big chandelier and the marble statues," she explained, and then she scurried off to the kitchen to find some mustard. 2 barrels of cider were retrieved from TumTum's cellar, and then the feast got underway. The colonel carved the sausage with his sword, and the brigadier sliced the bread with a cutlass, and there were enough hot dogs for each mouse to eat until his stomach was fit to burst. There's their feast. Nutmeg took a slice of sausage to TumTum in the living room, and he wolfed it all down with a cup of strong tea. The general sat with them, giving them a blow-by-blow account of the battle. "Quite ingenious, General, quite ingenious," TumTum kept muttering with his mouth full, and Nutmeg and Mrs. Marchmouse laughed until they wept when the general recounted how the mice had swung from Aunt Ivy's earrings and turned somersaults on her pearl necklace. "Oh, poor woman!" Nutmeg cried, dabbing tears from her eyes. "Poor, poor woman!" But when Nutmeg remembered the horror through which Aunt Ivy put TumTum, it was hard for her to feel sorry for her. Finally, when the general felt he had been congratulated enough, he made to take his leave. "We'd best be getting home, Poppet," he said, turning to his wife. "It will be dawn before we know it." "Goodness, yes," she replied, remembering that she hadn't slept for... How long was it? 1 day? 2 days? She was too tired to remember, and she suddenly longed for her warm bed in the gun cupboard. "We'll need a hot water bottle," she thought, thinking that all the fires would have long since died out. "I'll go and dismiss the mice," the general said, getting to his feet. And yet he found himself oddly reluctant to go. Much as he loved Mrs. Marchmouse, the adventurer in him dreaded returning to his quiet life at home. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Nutty?" he asked TumTum, hopefully. "Oh, no, General, I think you've done quite enough," TumTum replied, but Nutmeg was blushing. "There is something, General," she said hesitantly, "but I'm afraid it might be asking rather a lot of you. I'm sure you're yearning to get home." "Not if duty calls, Mrs. Nutmouse," he replied stiffly. "Well," she went on, "it's just that TumTum and I have been trying so hard to keep Rose Cottage in order, to mend the radiators, seal the cracks in the window panes, patch the leaks in the ceiling, and dust and scrub and all that so that the children can live decently. But it's all proven too much for us. I'm sure you've noticed what a pitiful state the place is in. But with a whole army of you here, and also healthy and strong, I thought perhaps you could have a go at getting the place shipshape." The general beamed, delighted to be given another chance to take command. "Leave it to me, Mrs. Nutmouse," he said. "Give us an hour or so, and we'll have Rose Cottage looking fit for a mouse. My army numbers a plumber, and an electrician, and a carpenter, and a window glazer, and an engineer, and a thatcher, and a plasterer." "But would they be able to tackle human-sized things?" Nutmeg asked doubtfully. "Of course they would," the general replied. "I called the engineer around to my manor house just last week to fix the overhead light in the gun room. He broke into the fuse box and sorted it out in no time. Said it was only a tripped switch. And when a pipe started leaking onto our gun cupboard, the plumber climbed up and patched it for me with some of his wife's old copper saucepans. If humans had any sense, they'd always employ mice for the fiddly jobs like that." "Quite so," TumTum agreed. "We could put every human laborer out of business." No wonder they're so wary of us then," the general said, making for the door. Then he marched off to the ballroom to start bossing everyone around. From Nutmouse Hall, the Nutmouses and Mrs. Marchmouse could hear the distant hum of activity as the army advanced through Rose Cottage, putting things to right. At one point there was a loud hiccup, followed by a deep whirring noise. "Sounds like they've got the old boiler working again," TumTum said admiringly. Then there was a great crashing and rattling in the kitchen as dozens of mice scrambled about scouring the stove. They went through each room, mending and scrubbing, and when they found the tin mouse in Mr. Mildew's study, they took it apart and gave it a whole new digestive system so that it could keep down all the crumbs it gobbled. They tested it on Mr. Mildew's desk, which was always covered with crumbs, and it worked very efficiently. "I must get one for the gun cupboard," the general thought. "Much better than a vacuum cleaner." There they are, working on fixing things up. Last of all, they carried out a lightning attack on the attic. The plumber unblocked the sink, the engineer repaired the engine on Arthur's train set, and the carpenter sawed little pieces off one of the shelves in the wardrobe and used them to board one of the broken window panes where TumTum's repairs had come undone. The colonel had discovered half a sack of coal in the woodshed, and the army carried enough lumps upstairs to light the attic fire. Just as the flames were beginning to flicker, 2 great human fists emerged from Arthur's bed and stretched slowly into the air. With a start, the general realized that dawn had crept up on them. The sun was pouring through the window. "Downstairs, quick!" he ordered, and all at once the army started hurling toward the attic steps. The general brought up the rear, and had Arthur sat up and opened his eyes a moment sooner, he would have seen an elderly mouse charging across his bedroom floor, brandishing a pistol. We actually have one more chapter before we start the next book, I guess. All right, that's good. So that'll finish us up for today. Chapter 15. It was the most wonderful day in Rose Cottage. When Arthur and Lucy woke up, they discovered that Nutmeg had been back with a vengeance, lighting fires and mending trains, and then they went downstairs and found the whole cottage transformed. But the best surprise of all came when they opened the living room door and realized that Nutmeg had carried out her promise after all. Aunt Ivy had vanished. "Do you think she's gone for good?" Arthur asked, hardly daring to believe it. Looks like it, Lucy said joyfully, for all their aunt had left behind was a pair of tweezers. She had also left a lizard earring, which had fallen off during the fray, but the general had taken it back to hang in the gun cupboard as a souvenir. Nutmeg said she'd do it, and she sure has. As the reality sank in, they both fell silent for a moment. They hadn't realized Nutmeg was quite so influential. I wonder what she did to make her so frightened, Arthur said, for they both heard Aunt Ivy shrieking in the night. You don't think she really sent hundreds of fluorescent mice to attack Aunt Ivy, do you? Of course not, Lucy said firmly, for that was too terrible a thought. Even Aunt Ivy doesn't deserve that. But Nutmeg moved in such mysterious ways that secretly Lucy thought she wouldn't have put anything past her, but somehow neither of the children felt it right to question Nutmeg's methods. They just felt very happy she had come back. Presently, Mr. Mildew appeared. Good morning, he said cheerfully. He was holding his tin mouse and looking immensely pleased with himself. He'd expected to spend another day struggling to get it going, but when he turned it on after he woke up, it was gobbling beautifully and keeping everything down. Couldn't for the life of him remember how he'd done it. There it is. But now he was going to rush out to the post office to have it couriered to the manager of the department store in London. I might be rich again, he thought, and the idea made him feel just a little bit giddy. There was some sort of racket last night, wasn't there? He asked, pulling on a pair of boots over his pajamas and trying to remember what it was all about. It was Aunt Ivy, Lucy said. She ran into the garden screaming that she was being attacked by orange mice. I should think everyone in the village must have heard her, and now she's gone. Gone? Mr. Mildew repeated disbelievingly. He looked in the living room, then in the hall, then in the kitchen, and Aunt Ivy wasn't there. Then Lucy spotted the note Aunt Ivy had left on the table, weighted under the milk jug. The writing was scrawled and messy. It had clearly been written in a great hurry. Mr. Mildew sat down and fished his glasses from his pocket, then read it out loud. Dear Walter, your cottage is infested with wild mice. Hundreds and thousands of them, possibly millions. They are armed and they are orange and they are out to kill. They are living in the bookshelf and the sofa and the sink and the laundry basket. They are everywhere. They have colonized the entire cottage. I am leaving for my own safety. I advise you to do the same. Ivy. Poor old Ivy, Mr. Mildew muttered. Orange mice indeed. In Nutmouse Hall, the army had returned to the ballroom, where TumTum was doing the rounds, thanking each mouse in turn for rescuing him. He was walking cautiously with a stick, but he was already feeling much stronger. The mice finally disbanded, crossing the kitchen floor, while the Mildews were poring over Aunt Ivy's letter. The general was the last to leave, hovering a while at the Nutmouse's front door. I could stay here and stand guard, he suggested to TumTum, just in case. Well, in case of any further trouble. Oh, no, General, TumTum said kindly, taking him by the paw. You have saved my life, and I am not going to let you do anything else for us, but please take this. TumTum walked stiffly toward the oak chest by the fire and picked up a long brass telescope. It belonged to my great-great-great-grandfather, he said, presenting it ceremoniously to the general. He served in the Royal Mouse Navy. He traveled far and wide along the stream, all the way to the next village, I'm told. And there's the telescope. The general was very stirred. Thank you, Mr. Nutmouse, he said solemnly. I will always treasure it. Then he closed his eyes and set up a silent prayer that there might soon be another battle, so he could have an occasion to use it. And he prayed the same thing all the way home to the gun cupboard, but not out loud, for fear of upsetting Mrs. Marchmouse. When the Marchmouses had gone, TumTum and Nutmeg shut their front door and retreated to the kitchen. It was breakfast time, so Nutmeg boiled a kettle for tea and made some buttered toast, a big pot of porridge, 2 boiled eggs, and a round of pancakes. Then she laid the table and they sat down to eat, thinking how nice it was to be alone again. He's a strange fellow, that General Marchmouse, TumTum said philosophically. Anyone would think he actually enjoyed going to war and risking life and limb and all that. Well, I suppose some mice crave adventure, said Nutmeg. But I hope we don't have another one, TumTum. I don't feel I'm quite cut out for them. Oh, I don't think there'll be any more adventures coming our way, dear, TumTum said confidently. We've had more than our share. From now on, we'll just live happily ever after. Nutmeg agreed with him, and then they sat down to breakfast and put all the trouble from their minds. And that's the end of TumTum and Nutmeg. But the next book in this is called The Great Escape. And we'll start that one next week. I wonder what they need to escape from. I hope you all been enjoying TumTum and Nutmeg, and you'll enjoy the next book that we read about TumTum and Nutmeg, and then we'll decide whether we'll read the third one. Maybe we'll finish the whole one. Or maybe you have an idea of a book that we should read. You can always let me know. Send me a message. It was nice being here with you this afternoon. I wish we could be in person, but that will happen someday. Meanwhile, everyone take care, be well, and hope to see you soon. Bye.